Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second of CartoPac's 2013 webinar series. Today's presentation is entitled The Power of CartoPac Studio. Our presenter will be Jake Oakdahl. Jake has been with CartoPac for the last 6 years in various roles and is now the Director of Sales, though he first joined CartoPac because of his expertise in GIS. Just a quick word about the format today. If you have any questions during the presentation, please just go ahead and type those in that questions pane on the right side of the screen, and we can have Jake answer those at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jake.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you to everyone in attendance today for our webinar, The Power of CartoPac Studio. We're going to focus in on the CartoPac Studio application for today's webinar, but before we do, give a little bit of background on the company, and we'll cover a quick review as well from the previous webinar. We have a great audience here today. I know many of you may be joining us that are current CartoPac clients, many of you that we've had some discussions with throughout the years, and many of you may be brand new to CartoPac as well. So we'll touch on components of the other key software pieces within the suite of tools, if you will. But again, today we'll be focused on the power of CartoPac Studio. A quick bit about CartoPac. We have been in business ongoing 14 years and have been focused on mobile and field data collection throughout that time. We are both an Esri business partner and a Trimble business partner, and look to leverage those technologies as well as other technologies when we deploy these solutions. We work in a variety of markets, from large presence in oil and gas, and recently an increased presence within the engineering and consulting realm as well. The previous CartoPac webinar, Why CartoPac, was really driven and geared towards this engineering and consulting market. Much of what you'll hear me speak of today, I may reference that particular market as well. That being said, this applies to any market and any organization that may be looking to do field data collection, but you may hear me speak key components to speak directly to that market as well. So we'll start with a quick review going back to the previous webinar. This may provide some background information, some context as well as we dive into the specifics of CartoPac Studio. In the previous webinar, we asked the question, why a new mobile solution? Many organizations are collecting field data in a variety of ways. Believe it or not, many still do it with pen and paper, and maybe for good reasons as well. You never get an error message when you're using a piece of paper. But that being said, there are a number of reasons why organizations often look to improve or change their current mobile solution. And a big one is often just looking at getting better data quality. Now that may be an increase in GIS or geospatial accuracy, perhaps the GPS accuracy, but very often that's looking at the overall accuracy of the data, the attribution, the quality, the metadata involved with field data collection. Very often we're told that an improvement in productivity and efficiency is one of the key drivers when looking at a mobile solution. And that may be driven by a need to get that field information into a system of record, into your enterprise database a little more easily. It may be providing tools that are more user-friendly, both from a field perspective and on the configuration and the end use of that data side as well. Often we're looking at providing something with a better common operating picture. We often throw around buzzwords like standardization and enterprise solutions, but these are key components when we're talking about something like a common operating picture. Trying to streamline and standardize across an organization to provide process and tools that are all focused on this big picture, this common operating picture, from both field data collection and then how that data is utilized on the back end. Now, especially within the engineering and consulting and the contracting market, the flexibility to meet diverse requirements is often a key driver that we hear as well. Whether it be a variety of different projects the seasonality involved, the changes within a project, having flexibility to meet those diverse requirements is often a key driver when looking for a new solution as well. Well, that's all fine and good, but we also know that there are barriers to adopting a new technology. And some of the obvious ones might be cost. In some cases, it can be very difficult to make a new software purchase, again, particularly within that consultant framework, where pulling from a capital budget for a software purchase may be nearly impossible for adopting a new technology. The status quo, what we do right now is good enough. That's something that we hear very often as a barrier, even though they know they want to change, even though that these organizations very often want to change. It can be difficult to say, well, what we do is okay. It's a competitive environment out there with limited time and resources as well, so making that change can be difficult. We're all tasked to do more with less, and the time and resources available, both the time to learn a new technology, implement a new technology, these are all common barriers that organizations face. And so we wrapped up last webinar talking about CartoPac specifically and some of the advantages that address both those, why make a change, and the barriers as well. And there's some of the key components that you see here on this slide that we'll address specifically with the CartoPac Studio application. Within CartoPac, the ability to rapidly configure and deploy these field data collection solutions is one of the key areas that many of our clients have focused in on. We're going to look at that specifically again in CartoPac Studio. Relational database support. Everything from the operators within the energy industry that we work with, perhaps supporting complex relational data models such as PODs or APDM, to the consultants and contractors that may be building their own relational data models to fit specific deliverables and needs for the projects they do, to natural resource management within federal and state governments that we work within as well. Across the board, there's very often a need to utilize complex relational data models, but there has often been a gap in the technology available to support that in the field. Well, what you'll see here today is CartoPac works very well with a relational database and can support that very well. When you look at the flip side from a complex relational database, you're often going to have this need as well to take that and simplify it, make it something usable from a field perspective, because those two things don't always mesh up as far as the needs in the office, the needs in the field. So CartoPac's ability to configure, maintain, and deploy these intelligent forms that are also very user-friendly, this is a key advantage as well. All of this is really gearing towards that improved productivity as well as scalability, taking these different components, being able to streamline this to save time, to have better data accuracy, to have an overall more productive solution. And then something specific that we talked about in the last webinar is our new usage-based licensing model. Again, this was put together and geared towards the engineering and consulting market. We are seeing some adoption outside of that market as well, but in particular for consultants being able to utilize the technology, whether it be due to seasonality or, again, varying projects and how those contracts work. This is another key advantage. Okay, so that's a quick review where we left off in the previous webinar. And we're going to jump in and talk specifically about our configuration platform, the CartoPac Studio tool. But I also wanted to just provide a little more context as to where that fits into the overall suite of tools in CartoPac technology. CartoPac Studio, where we'll focus here today on the configuration side. The deployment, as far as how do we get data to the field. How do we deploy this from office to field and then back again, getting that data from field back to office. The deployment methods, which can be via ArcMap, which in the demonstration today, that's where we'll focus in particular, or through ArcGIS for server. In most of our large enterprise deployments, that's the deployment method that is utilized. We'll take a quick peek at that, but again, we're going to be focused on Studio here today. And of course, then the data collection. collecting the data via CartoPac Mobile. So you're going to see bits and pieces of that as it relates to the configuration process in CartoPac Studio, but we won't go into the details of the actual user interface. So for anything that we don't cover here today, I invite you to contact us, contact your local CartoPac dealer, visit us on the website. We have previous webinars that we've recorded that highlight a lot of these other components, and of course we're always happy to speak to you directly. Okay, so let's dive in a bit to the CartoPac Studio and talk a little bit about the key concepts that we're going to cover here today. I've talked already a little bit about the configuration environment, ability to rapidly configure. And a big component there is that what we'll see in CartoPac Studio, everything that we do within CartoPac Studio is configuration driven, not development. We won't write a line of code within CartoPac Studio, yet we'll still be able to provide very customized, very efficient and effective and usable solutions, all via configuration. I mentioned the relational data model, the relational database support as well. So we'll look here in CartoPac Studio how we can leverage that from a field data collection perspective. The forms, what we can do to add some intelligence, data validation, things that we can do to the forms within the forms environment, not only to assist in making the workflow in the field more efficient, but also, again, addressing the data quality business rules, validation, things of that nature. And then also we talked before about having that flexibility. Being able to rapidly design and deploy these solutions has been another key driver, especially again within the consultant market, but also within other markets. Variety of different solutions with different needs. To have a tool where you can rapidly make those changes and rapidly get that out to the field. Those are some of the key concepts that we're going to talk about in CartoPac Studio. But before I go on in my presentation, we want to engage with you, the audience, a little bit. So we've put a poll together. We want to try to get a sense for what are the obstacles that you face in your current deployments of mobile, your current configuration. Now, for those of you already using CartoPac, hopefully you don't have the problems that you see here today, but even if you do, hopefully we can address some of that in what we talk about, perhaps provide some insight. So take a moment, if you would, to look at the poll there up on screen and answer that question. Again, if it's not represented here, apologies, we took kind of the top 5 that we often hear. So we'll leave that open just a moment more, and then we'll take a look at the results. Once we've got those in-house here. So let's go ahead and close that poll. Hopefully you've had a moment to fill that out, and let's see what type of response we got. Okay. Well, it looks like we've got a number of different responses here, but the time it takes to deliver the solution seems to be there's a commonality there. And that definitely makes sense, and there's no surprises there from our perspective. And I think what we'll talk about here today should largely address that, the time it takes to build, design, deploy, maintain these solutions. All right, so we'll go ahead and close that and hop back in here to the presentation. So a quick overview from an application perspective of what we're going to talk about, how we're going to break this down looking at CartoPac Studio. I'm going to get into Studio here in a moment, and there's a lot of functionality, there's a lot we can do, and there's probably going to be a lot that I can't cover here today. But we can really break these down into 3 core components, or 3 core areas within Studio. And what we're going to start with is really looking at working with the data. All right, so one of the key concepts that you'll see throughout with CartoPac is it's very database friendly. All right, and so we're going to work directly with your data. Of course, I'll be working with my example data set here, but in concept, this is working with your data. Okay, so we'll look at how we can configure and do some different configuration and apply different functionality within working with your database environment. We'll also look at then the configuration of the forms. Okay, we'll look at the different functionality, the different controls, again, some of the intelligence, some of the automation, the different things we can do in configuring those forms. And then we'll also talk about some of the general mobile workflow configuration options. How can we make the solution as efficient as possible? How can we affect what the user sees on the mobile device? Different configuration components to that end. Okay, so with that, we're going to jump into Studio next. And I'll be working, again, within an ArcMap environment. And in this example solution, this is the municipal water-based asset type of solution here. And we'll see within the solution that's been built out that we'll review, there's the capability both for asset inventory, so collecting new data, as well as for an inspection or maintenance type of workflow, working with existing data. And again, this brings in that relational data model concept. So we'll look at a couple of different types of workflows within this one particular example. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over here to ArcMap. Okay, so many of you may already be familiar with, at a high level, the CartoPac solution. A quick review, again, I'm not going to jump into a lot of detail on the components outside of Studio, but just to give you an idea here. We're looking at an ArcMap environment. The CartoPac toolbar that you see here is an extension within ArcMap. This gives me the ability to download to the device. Very simple process, pulling directly from this environment directly down to a Windows handheld device for data collection. Once I've collected that data, uploading it directly back into that target database or target databases. Some additional tools in here for kind of a dashboard of project management, if you will. And then modifying or creating solutions in Studio, again, where we'll focus. In this example, I'm working with a personal geodatabase that we've put together, but this could very easily be a file geodatabase. It could be an SDE database. Again, in our large enterprise deployments, that's one of the key benefits, is our ability to work directly within that SDE environment. That being said, it's also very valuable to be able to deploy rapid desktop solutions like you see here, leveraging file or personal geodatabases and shapefiles as well, if you'd like. So you can see I've got a handful of assets or feature classes here, points, lines, polygons, and a non-spatial table, and some imagery in the background as well. So we're going to start by launching CartoPac Studio. So I've launched this here from my toolbar within ArcMap. CartoPac Studio can also be launched as a standalone application, running it, accessing it here through my Start menu. That's typically utilized in the server-based environment, which again we'll touch on in a moment. Now, as I talked about before, really three core concepts: working with the data, the forms configuration, and then the general mobile workflow configuration. So we're going to start in the Solution Explorer environment. So Solution Explorer is then where I will work with the data. Now, since I've opened this from within ArcMap and within an existing solution, I've already got my database set up here, right? Now, by launching it via ArcMap, it will always pick up the database or databases that are being utilized in that MXD and place them here. If I were starting brand new, with a brand new solution, in order to right-click on databases, I could go to Add, and I've got some options as far as how I can add a connection to a database. So for example, if I was working within SDE, I would come in and I'd have these same properties and parameters that I'd fill out, just like you would in our catalog, to connect to that database. Once I've connected to my database, excuse me, or databases, I could then choose which tables I want to work with. So again, I right-clicked on the database, go to Select Tables, and again, you can see in my existing solution, I've got a number of those checked already. So when we get in here to choose and select which tables, that is not necessarily dependent on the layers that may be within the map document. Okay, so we can pull from layers that are within that database, even if they're not within the map document. And again, at the end of the day, it's really not dependent on the MXD in this case, but we're leveraging that here to some extent. So you can see the raster folder here as well. I added that, but I have not configured that. We may have time to talk about that a bit as well. I'm going to go ahead and cancel here. As you can see, I've got my database and then the tables, which include feature classes, non-spatial tables, and then you'll also see here, denoted by the $D, it has converted a domain value within that geodatabase into essentially a lookup table that we'll use here in CartoPac. So we'll see more on that here in a moment. Now, as I work through from the database level to the table level and then eventually on down into the attribute level, you'll see that the properties may be changing here on the right. A number of things that I can do within the properties. Some of the common property or parameters that we may interact with here is the transfer configuration. So within CartoPac, we can determine where we want to export data from, going to the field, as well as where we want to merge data back from field to Office. In the example you see here today, I'm exporting and merging to the same database, to the same feature classes. In an enterprise environment, this often, again, is being done in an SDE environment. So if I were connected to an SDE database, you would actually have a separate set of properties here for versioning. So we can tie this to a versioning scheme within SDE. So we download from, say, SDE.default, but when we upload, it comes up to a subversion where you can then QA, QC, reconcile, post, and so on. Within a non-SDE environment, or for that matter, a non-versioned environment, you could leverage staging tables. Or I may have a completely separate personal geodatabase with the exact same schema where I could say pull from this database and write to another database. That's done through the transfer configuration, which we can do at the database level as well as the table level here as well. Okay, so that's one of the common properties here. You can also see there's some additional capabilities here. For example, the layer selection type. The default setting is intersects AOI. And what this is referring to is when I go to download to the device, it will actually clip out according to the AOI, to the visual extent here within ArcMap. It will clip out the data. And that is, again, the default setting. But there are other settings that we can utilize here. For example, if we wanted to crop by another layer. So if you had a polygon that you had designated as a particular boundary for a field area, you could utilize that polygon and crop by that. You could crop by a selection, only pull down those that have selected, whether manually, programmatically, whatever that may be. So different ways in which we can subset the data here. In addition, you could implement some where clauses. If I only wanted to download the control valves where the ID met a certain criteria, whatever that may be. So you can get into some intricacies of here as far as how you subset the data, working with the data itself. Now, nothing that I do within Studio will actually change the database itself. Again, I'm just working with the database as it is. So you've already built your database, you've already got your schema in place, and whether it's an empty schema or existing data. Now I can come in here and I can preview that data. So I can get a look at my database table here, in this case for water control valve, and I can see my attributes, and that may be helpful as I'm designing out my solution here. Okay, but we're not going to actually change any of the, we're not going to modify or edit the database in particular. Okay, so database level, table level, and on down to the attribute level as well, we can put in additional configuration. So there's some additional capabilities here. I could do a SQL filter on a specific attribute as well. And then you'll also see metadata type as one of the key properties here also. So, for example, my water control valve, which we'll see the form that's been built here in a moment, has a created by attribute. And I want to automatically collect who created this. And I want to automatically collect when it was created. And we can do that by utilizing metadata to automatically populate that form in the field and then also populate that attribute in the database. And we set that here in the metadata type. Now, it's currently not set, and I'm going to leave it there because that's going to be a good example moment. So we've gone through and we've set up the data how we want to work with it. Picked the database or databases, the tables, and perhaps done some additional configuration. One of the other components here when we're building out a solution is, again, I may have a large, long laundry list here of attributes, of different fields, if you will, within this particular feature class. But let's say I'm only working with a handful of them in the field, and I don't need to be encumbered by the rest of them from a field data collection workflow process. So, again, going back to that transfer configuration, I could come in here and shift-click, control-click, choose the ones that perhaps I don't want in the field, and I could set that transfer configuration for those selected. I could set that to none. Again, it wouldn't change the database, but it would just change how I work with the data in the field. Now, that's an important note because when we build out forms, there are different ways we can do that. And so I'm going to shift now a little bit from working with the data to starting to get towards working with the forms themselves. So I'm going to go to my UI and Display tab. And I can see I have a default role is what this is. We're going to come back and talk about roles here in a minute. And so now we can see in a little more of a geospatial context, if you will, the points, lines, polygons, and non-spatial tables that I'm working with in my solution. You can also see that I have existing forms built here for a variety of these feature classes. Okay, but again, if I was starting from scratch or building a new form, I could simply right-click, go to Generate Form. Perhaps I want a new library. We'll call this Studio Demo. And you can see it defaults to a QVGA portrait, which is what we'll see, again, formatted to fit on a handheld device. But let's say I wanted to push this out on a tablet. I could switch that to a VGA landscape. So we'll go ahead and run this just to show you that example. So I'm going to say OK. And so what we've done is auto-generated a form here for this control valve. I'm going to switch now to the Forms Explorer. And so in my Forms Explorer, I have a tree view showing my different forms libraries, if you will. I'm going to delete one of these, previous demo, just to simplify it. You can see the water forms library for the existing forms that we're going to look at here in a moment, as well as then the forms library I just built for that new form. So when I've auto-generated a form, if I go here to my form preview, and I click through my tree view here, I can see that it's taken all the attributes, placed them on the screen, on the forms, as many as fit per tab, if you will. And so obviously that will vary if I'm using a VGA form versus what we'll look at here in a moment with the QVGA. So it only has a certain level of intelligence when it auto-generates the form for you, but there are some key areas when auto-generating a form that should be noted. For example, we saw previously there was a domain established within the geodatabase, and when there is a domain established, when I auto-generate a form, it automatically picks up that domain and creates this control as a drop-down. Okay, so there are certain things that it can do based on that data type, based on the domains. But as we'll see, the majority of the work you would do here is then coming in and cleaning this up, generating, building, modifying these forms to best match the workflow for your field personnel. Okay? For example, this ID field. Perhaps that's something I don't actually need. I can remove that control. And let's say project ID, I want that to be half, make it a little bit smaller. And I want to drag that up here. And I want to change this created by from this text box to a label control. So now I've right-clicked and I've gone to change type. And so now you're seeing here some of the different control types. We call these the different control types within CartoPac Studio. So you can see the basic text box that it put there. You saw an example of the drop-down a moment ago with the domain. A number of other controls, and we're going to go through and talk about these here in a moment. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to switch over to one of the existing forms, giving you a little bit of idea how you can go through and interact with these, changing both the size, the type, the location of these different controls. Of course, labeling. You know, it's come in here and it's labeled this first tab, tab 1. But I want to call this, you know, general info. So I'll just change that label. So very simple to come in here and generate a form and then go in and clean it up, you know, add some value here to the forms to really, again, make this an efficient data collection process for the field personnel. Let's jump over here, though, to some of the existing forms. Okay? So control valve, again, this is an example of that same schema, but a form that's had a little more work put into it. And when I say a little more work, you know, we're not talking days, weeks, months of work in order to put a solution together. This is something that can be done very rapidly. Depending on the complexity of the solution, you may have something out in 15 minutes. It may be a couple of days, again, depending on how much the complexity of the solution, if you will. But you can see here we've got a variety of different control types built in to this particular form. So, again, we talked before about the created by. This created by is set up as a label control, and the intent is that this automatically displays the value for the person who collected or this particular feature, right? And same for the time and the X and the Y coordinates. Now, whenever possible, we're going to leverage a drop-down because, again, on a handheld device, you don't want to be sitting there typing with the little stylus. Anytime we can use the drop-downs, easier for the field personnel, but it's also going to improve data quality. And because we're pulling directly from a domain or a lookup table, we're enforcing business rules here as well. But let's look in particular at one of these controls. Now, before I do, and before I go any further, I want to show you this form as it would appear on the handheld device. So what I'm going to do is, before I go any further, and this is kind of an example, is how you would go through the process. As you're building these out, you're going to want to test the forms as you go as well. So while I typically would download from the ArcMap environment itself, within Studio I can accomplish that as well, which again is typically for testing. So I'm going to click on Download. And from a testing perspective, I'm going to use the local machine option, which is the CartoPac mobile software running in a full Windows environment. It's also something that those who leverage a Toughbook or some type of Windows tablet can utilize this as well for the actual data collection. I'm going to use it from a testing perspective. I'm going to download. And so this is the download process of moving data from Office to field. Very simple process. Okay. I'm going to open up Tablet. And so here's my solution on a mobile device. Again, my this is on my laptop here, but again, it's the same exact software. The only difference that you would see here in the tablet version versus the Windows Mobile is the tools would be at the bottom, your screen versus upper left in this kind of standard Windows environment. So you can see it's asking for my user ID. All right, I am Jake. Say OK. And I'm going to click on the plus sign to add a new record. And again, for those of you who haven't seen CartoPac Mobile, I apologize, I'm going to run through some of this here rather quickly so we can stay focused on Studio. But I do invite you to engage with us or download a previous webinar to get a closer look. So I'm going to create a new point for a control valve. Tap on Create. Now I don't have the GPS on here in the office, so I'm just going to digitize one on screen. All right, so there I can see it's given me the form for the one I just auto-generated. All right, so very basic. It's got a GUID in here, auto-generated, that we'll get to in a moment to leverage relationships. The rest of this is just asking me to enter that data. So this isn't a very fluid workflow. This isn't giving me any additional value here to just come in here and type this. So I'm going to cancel this, and I'm going to come back in, and I'm going to say, all right, back in my Forms Explorer, I'm going to get rid of this. Remove that. Okay, so I made a quick change, and I'm going to leverage the existing form I've got. Overwrite that. Download. Download is complete. And open this up on the tablet. And now, if I've done everything correctly, when I go to collect a control valve, I'll have the form previously generated. So, what we see here is I found my first error based on my expectation that CreativBy would auto-generate my name here. Okay, so again, in that testing process, this is very often what you'll see. You're working through this, you're going to find you've missed something. Okay, no problem. I'm going to go back and fix that. I wanted to show some examples, though, here of the actual functionality. So, for example, my administrative area is north. My operational area, therefore, can only be one of the north districts. So we've built in a dependency here for the field user. Keep it simple, as well as high data quality. In addition, I've got a spatial query that's showing me the closest streets within that, close to that location, as well as then a street number. So we're building in a spatial query here. Some of the basic information, you can see that I've denoted this as required, and we'll look at that in Studio. If I say OK, it's going to make sure that I fill that out. So some data validation. And I could attach a photo here as well. Now, you'll see there's a checkbox. Inspection needed. If I check that box, it's added this tab. So we're going to go back here into Studio and talk through each one of these components that I'm showing you here on the form. This is now an example of a relationship supported on the device. I can add a related record, in this case related non-spatial record that is related to this point for a control valve. I can add that inspection, opens a new form, and I can fill out that information, so on and so forth. Okay, so I've found a few things that I need to fix, as well as there are a number of things I want to show you here in the Studio environment. So we're going to work backwards here. I'm going to show you the functionality, and then we're going to walk through that process of making a quick update to the solution in the case of the created by metadata. Okay, so let's come back to our Forms Explorer, come back to the control valve at the tabular level. There's my general. I'm going to come down here to the administrative area, and more so for the operational area. If you recall, we had the dependencies set up there so that only operational areas related to the administrative area that I just picked would be shown in that drop-down. So I'm going to come in here to my list query, so my properties here. So what you see here is some basic SQL, and there are some specific CartoPac syntax added in here that we'll talk about, but this is really the level of complexity that we get to. We're not going to write any code, but we can write some simple query statements to do quite a lot here in Studio. We've got a client that gave us an example, I believe. In a previous solution, they had written thousands of lines of code to support a very specific workflow. When we came in and did the Studio training, I believe it was just a couple SQL queries to accomplish the same thing. Rapid development, much easier to maintain than a complex code base to accomplish the same thing. So in this case, you can see pulling from a lookup table where a field name equals a particular value and that administrative area. So I won't go into the details. Again, these are things covered in the Studio training as far as building out these SQL queries, but they're all covered in the training, and most of them are pretty straightforward as well. Another example, the spatial query that we looked at, in this case selecting streets. another simple query. And you can see some of the specific CartoPac syntax for those of you that are familiar with SQL queries, where we're looking for streets within 500 feet of the current location. So these are some of the capabilities you can introduce into the solution. Let's jump over to the valve inspection tab. If you recall, what I showed you there a moment ago was that valve inspection tab only shows up when I check this box, inspection needed. So it's labeled inspection needed, but you can see the actual attribute is work needed. Okay? If I go to the tab, I have set some logic to show or hide based on that checkbox. That checkbox is a Boolean value. If it's checked, it's true, and therefore it shows the tab. Now, the actual related table component that you can see here is also very easily configured. From the control valve, on this tab, I have a relationship control. If I right-click, there's the relationship control, right? Within this relationship control, I've then configured in the properties, first to say what is my source table key field. So within CartoPac, we typically leverage GUID data types to guarantee they're unique for our primary and foreign keys and relationships. In CartoPac, it is independent of whether or not you have a relationship class in your Esri environment. It can work with or without that. All it cares about is that we set up the primary and foreign keys, that the database architecture is such to support that. So we set our source table key field, what the related table might be, and then, of course, the related table key field, and I may want to then display some attributes here as well. Okay? Now, I think I just went in and clicked something there, and as you can see, actually, this is a great example. So, as I've gone through and been working here, some of you may have noticed down here we have validation results. This is a great component because if I've made an error, it will let me know here. And if I double-click that, it will take me directly to that error. So I can go in here and fix this. I believe it was ID. And now I have 0 errors. Okay. So for the sake of time, I know I'm working through this all pretty rapidly. I want to show a couple of other things here, though, before we wrap up and save some time for questions. One in particular is if we go back to the first tab here, and when I ran my test, I noticed it didn't auto-generate my name. So I'm going to go back here to Solution Explorer, and we talked about this very early on, and I promised I'd come back to it, so that's what I'm going to do. And for that field, created by, I don't have the metadata type set. If I come in and I set this to created by, I'm now telling it I want it to automatically populate with that created by value. You'll also notice that I have introduced an error. If I double-click that, again, it will take me to that error. And although the actual field name is created by, because I've set a metadata type, I need to put that specific value in here. Okay? So this process I just went through, changing it in the Solution Explorer, and a quick change here in the forms, is what I need to do to auto-capture that information. Same thing if we're doing it for the date, so some of that basic metadata, but we can also be doing this for the spatial accuracy information, the GPS, the PDOT, the HDOT, average number of satellites. Was it heads-up digitized? Was it captured with GPS? What was the worst accuracy, best accuracy, so on and so forth. All of this valuable information that we can collect, and much of that, if not all, should that be your choice, could be completely behind the scenes. So the field user doesn't have to interact with that, take the time to do so. So what we'll see here, I've made that change. Let's do a quick download. I'm going to overwrite that previous project. Download is completed successfully. We'll look here on the CartoPac tablet. And Let's add a new control valve. And let's add this right here. Okay. So, let me go back here. Cancel that. I actually did it on the gravity main. My mistake. We'll make that quick change here as well. Change this here to the created by. Fix my errors and try again. While not perfect from a demonstration perspective, it does really highlight, though, the process. You know, very often I get going quickly. I'm making these changes. When I go in and I go to my test environment, I can very easily flesh those out. So let's try that again. Choose my control valve. Create. And now that I've changed that, it's automatically populating that value. Not only automatically populating it here on the form, but when I upload this data, again, back to that target database environment, it will automatically populate those attributes. So a lot we can do here. So, missed my required field, but that's okay. I'm going to cancel this. Another thing I want to show you, well, we've still got some time. We talked about working with the data. We've looked at the forms and some of those key controls. There's a number of things that we didn't even get a chance to dive into. But also generally working with that mobile configuration. Okay? So from a field user's perspective, we've generated this project. I've got my background data. We could have the imagery here as well. When I'm ready to collect data, as you've seen, I go and I tap or click on the plus sign. But one of the things I've noticed here is that I've got all of these features listed out, and they're not all relevant for my actual field data collection. In my workflow example, let's say that the only features that I would actually collect in this manner would either be a control valve or a water gravity main. Many of these are for reference only. We can see some of the lookup tables here, as well as an inspection that through my workflow I only get to via the other form. So what I want to show you next are some of the other capabilities in Studio, how we configure what the user sees and how they interact with the solution. All right, so I'm going to cancel this. So let's come back in here to the UI and display environment. And I can see as I click through, I've got additional properties here. And I'm not going to go through all of this. You can see everything from symbology, we've got labeling, different properties we can work with here. Now one of the nice things working within the ArcMap environment is I could come up here to the tools and say capture layer colors in Z order. I'm going to capture the symbology and colors of my existing feature classes. So I don't have to come in here and configure each one separately. I can leverage the Esri TrueType fonts and the symbology I have in my ArcMap document. But going back to my previous example where I go to add data and I see all of that information that's not relevant to my actual workflow, I can very easily change that. I'm going to go ahead and let's just minimize these for simplicity's sake. For the different tables that I don't want to see from that drop-down, I'm going to highlight each of those and come to this Disable Plus button property. I can even just do a quick double-click to change that. And now I've changed that value to true. Now I'm going to download again my little testing process to see how that looks. Overwrite the solution. And back into tablet. Now we can see here, when I go to the plus button, I now only have control valve and water gravity main. So beyond working within the forms, there are things from a mobile perspective, and that was a very simple change, yet a highly effective one to make this as efficient as possible. There are additional things that can be done within the user interface option sets that can be modified to turn certain toolbars on or off, to leverage, again, and enforce what that field personnel sees when they open up the mobile application. So we scratched the surface. Hopefully we've provided some insight here within the CartoPac Studio environment, some of the power and capabilities. By all means, we have not covered everything, but hopefully you're getting at least a little bit of an idea here. So a couple of other things I want to show and talk about here, and then we'll wrap up and address any questions that we've got. As you've seen me working here within the ArcMap environment, making those changes, the same would apply as if I were working in a server environment. So here you can see an example of an ArcGIS server web map. The same download, upload, and some additional capabilities here that we've covered in a previous webinar. But that same capability where I can leverage this directly from an ArcGIS server environment. In the same manner, though, that I did work in Studio here, directly from my ArcMap environment, I can easily come in here and publish this solution to a web service. So if I'm leveraging this in a web environment, in that ArcGIS server environment. Number of different ways that you can utilize this technology, different deployment scenarios. So we talked data, we talked forms, we talked a little bit about some of the basic configuration, the validation, and how we can use CartoPac Studio to build very effective and efficient solutions. So I'm going to switch over here back to the presentation. And we're going to save a little bit of time here for some questions. Hopefully we've provided enough here to get you thinking. And hopefully some of you are saying, what's next? What you saw here today, that very specific workflow, the database and the solution as you see it, is available as a 30-day evaluation package at no charge. Give you the capability to come in here, push the buttons, play with the technology, as well as you could utilize the evaluation package, the software provided, Studio, mobile, and the extension there within ArcMap to work within your own data environment. See how this can be utilized to leverage your database and your workflow. For those of you joining us today that may be existing clients, may be on the verge of your first pilot, leveraging CartoPac, getting ready to utilize CartoPac, we will have an upcoming web-based studio training at a discounted rate. Our studio trainings are typically held specifically for a client, either web-based or on-site, but this will be limited seating, however open to all pre-scheduled studio trainings where we'll go into greater detail on a lot of those key components. I also want to make sure to invite you to our next webinar in the series where we will look at a server-based solution, a specific solution for wetlands, particularly wetland delineation, and providing a solution to meet, in this case, the Army Corps of Engineers requirements for reporting on wetland criteria, wetland evaluation. So that will show not only the overall workflow of CartoPac, but as well some of the back-end capabilities, reporting tools, being able to take that data and generate a report. With that, we're running out of time. I want to thank you all for joining us. Again, we're going to address some questions right now, but please do feel free to contact us, whether it be to leverage the evaluation package, any specific questions. You can get a hold of us via the website. You can download previous webinars as well. Get a hold of us via email or through your local CartoPac partners. With that, we'll hand this back over to Sam to open up the floor, and we'll address any questions you've got.
All right. Thanks, Jake. Before we get, I don't know if we're going to have time to do this this one question, but before we get too far away from the technology, one respondent wanted to know if you could show something that was a line feature.
Sure. I think we could probably do that real quick. And hopefully those of you with us can maintain and stay with us a couple extra minutes if you'd like. So I'm not sure specifically what you were driving towards as far as how the solution works, but I can show you real quickly. I'll download again the project. So CartoPac works well, points, lines, polygons, non-spatial data. When we're talking data collection, oops, excuse me, go back there. When we're talking data collection in the field, linear features as well as polygons can be created in a couple of different ways. One would be kind of walking along the streaming GPS breadcrumb style, although very often what we see is users utilize more of a vertice-to-vertice connect the dots workflow. Now I'm going to be digitizing here. Go ahead and create. And so what you're seeing here in this case is more of a vertice-to-vertice, but that can be leveraged in the field with the GPS on, an additional set of tools here for pause and vertice collection. This vertex here, you'd see an additional pause button where we could be walking, if you will. Envision that there is, say, an obstacle here or this lake, and perhaps I need to do a pipeline that actually goes all the way across. I could come over here, auto connect those different features. Not sure if that gets to the heart of the question, but again, we can address that offline. We're happy to address specific questions and show you how the technology works.
All right, going down to the next question. How much training would my analyst need to learn how to build forms?
Great question. So there were a couple key pieces to that question, and I'm glad you said for my analyst, because that is the typical user would be an analyst. We often get the question, regarding configuration versus development. You don't need to be a developer, as you've seen here. I'm not a developer. I took one VB course back in college, and that was probably the last time I wrote any code of any significance. With a solution like you see here today, to deploy that, to build that out, we're talking not a lot of time, a couple of days. Learning how to get to that point, also something that can be done very rapidly. Our standard trainings that we typically offer are 2 days on site, where we spend the first day very focused on kind of what we went through here, only in more detail and probably not as rushed, the functionality. The second day we spend the time very focused on building out your solution or the first part of your solution. So no more than 2 days to train someone. With that said, we've had many successful implementations where they went with a half-day web-based training. Between the web-based training and the documentation and the support that we're willing to provide as well, we can enable you very rapidly to utilize this tool, get it out in the field. So there are different training options, but long-winded answer to your question is someone can be trained very rapidly in as little as a half-day web training. Sometimes even less. We've had people who, we highly recommend leveraging our training resources at a minimum, those half-day training resources. But again, with our documentation, people can pick this up on their own pretty rapidly.
Okay, going to the next question. When do changes you make to forms get pushed out to the field?
So, as you saw there in the demonstration, when I went in and I made a change, that is immediately pushed out upon the next download. So, for example, if I come in here and let's make a quick change, all right? Let's say that control valve, I don't want this first tab to be called General. I want it to be called Valve Info. Okay? I've changed that to Valve Info. So you saw me go through a very rapid process of testing, pushing that out. But that is the exact same process that would be utilized in a real-world environment. So let's say I've made that change, and I'm either now pushing this out from ArcMap, which I could do immediately. Now I don't have a unit plugged in because again we've been focused more on the studio piece, but it's the same process whether I'm using direct to the unit or to my local machine. Once I download, as long as CartoPac's not running, once I download, let me go ahead and get out of there, and you don't have too many things going on at once on your screen. Get back in there. That is immediately going to be pushed out to the device. So you've seen that here in a desktop workflow. Now, in a server-based environment, as opposed to that process I went through there, I would make my changes and publish it up to the web service. Once I make that change, users now in the environment, wherever they may be, again, because this really facilitates that dispersed enterprise-wide environment, I click download, that change is going to be pushed out. And again, as you can see here on the mobile side, I now go to control valve. It's now valve info. So very rapid to make those changes. I hope that's answered your question, and by all means, we're happy to follow up if there's some additional details required there.
Okay, we still have 2 questions open right here, so we'll try to get them answered quickly enough that people can get on with their day. But one question is Esri a requirement? Do we or will we support SQL data, spatial data?
Yes, we do. We do support SQL spatial data. I mentioned at the beginning that we heavily leverage Esri technology. We are an Esri business partner. But that being said, the CartoPac technology is not dependent, per se, on that environment. In order to, I say, get the most out of CartoPac, it's probably worthwhile to leverage this in the Esri environment. But that being said, we do have customers who leverage a straight SQL database, SQL spatial. So yes, you can support field data collection in a non-Esri database environment with CartoPac.
Okay, and the last one, is it possible to display satellite imagery in the background on the device?
Yes, it is, and that's something we didn't get a chance to cover here today, but it's actually one of the key benefits with CartoPac. We have a patent on our raster graphics engine on the mobile device that allows us to utilize large raster data sets, even on a handheld device where there are both processing and memory limitations. You didn't see it here in this demo, but it's something that we can cover as well. And real quickly, we can show you that in the studio environment, let me close this here, and just pop over there. In the studio environment, the raster data, I could come in here and say I would like to download these as well. And I'm actually going to make one other change and just name that one name. We'll call it demo. And I'm going to do a download, check the box, overwrite. So in this case, I'm actually going to download imagery directly from, say, this ArcMap environment. Now that works fine for smaller image sets. We actually have a separate application for processing larger image sets, our CartoPac Imagery Studio. Very simple tool, the ability to process gigabytes of raster data to a file format that we could put on an SD card on the device and leverage different raster data types very easily. Now we can also set those up to be scale dependent. I'll go and open these up. We can set those up to be scale dependent so that they only show up when we're zoomed in at a certain, certain zoom level, if you will. You could have multiple different data sets, but hopefully that answers your question. Okay.
Okay then.
Well, I appreciate everybody's attendance. and hopefully you were able to stick with us here throughout past our 2 o'clock curfew, if you will. And Sam, you may have some follow-ups here, and I again just want to thank you all for attendance.
Yeah, thank you all. And for anyone interested in obtaining a recording of this or any of our past webinars, it will be posted in the webinar section of our website at www.cartopac.com in the next couple of days. And feel free to contact us with any questions we didn't get to talk about today, or if you want to request the evaluation software. Thanks again for coming. Have a great day, all.